Thanks for listening to Uncle Sam's Soccer Podcast, keeping you up to date with the latest in American soccer. And don't forget to subscribe.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to this edition of Uncle Sam's Soccer Podcast. I'm your host, Steven Jotter, and joining me would be Armand Kafai and Jake Watroba. However, they got sacked. No, I'm just kidding. That would be awful. They did not get sacked. We recorded an episode, and it got deleted. I don't know what happened to the recording, but it vanished, so we're not able to upload that to the interwebs for you to listen to it. Now, before I continue, follow us on Twitter, Uncle Sam's Soccer Pod. You can find the show on any major podcast platform. Review the show, subscribe, send in your comments. We love it all. Now, as I was explaining, the audio file is gone, but anytime we have a guest, we always have two people recording the interview. This week, Jake recorded the interview as I would record the full episode. So the backup interview will be playing on this episode because we think it's that interesting. Now, our guest Clemente Lisi has been covering the U.S. men's national team and MLS for many years. He's written about it. He's published books, articles. He contributes to USsoccerplayers.com. And he explains the context into why the Earthquakes were relocated to Houston and how that compares and contrasts to the current situation going on with the Columbus Crew potentially headed to Austin. Now, Clemente does a wonderful job. Big shout out to him. Great insight and context. So we highly recommend listening to this interview, although the audio file isn't the best. So just a warning, listeners, we'll be back next week with a full episode with great commentary from us, feedback, and So we apologize, Clemente. This is not how we normally do things, but we'll be back next week. Enjoy the interview. Here it is. Now is Clemente Lisi. He has covered soccer for 2 decades, written several books on the subject. He currently is a writer for USsoccerplayers.com, where he covers MLS and the U.S. men's national team. Clemente, how are we doing? Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Clemente, we just got done talking about the USL's rebrand. Do you have any thoughts on what they did this past week?
Yeah, so, I mean, if you look back at American soccer history, you know, the so many leagues in this country, it's often defined as an alphabet soup. And given what happened in the last couple of years between the USL and the NASL, the USL has become a closer, stronger partner to MLS in developing players. So this rebranding, this restructuring is good for them, and it's good for players in this country. I mean, not much has changed other than moving some things around, and you often see that in American soccer. You know, some leagues every once in a while think they need a fresh coat of paint, which is what they do. And but I think as long as the partnership with MLS continues and they have different structures and more leagues, more divisions, I think that's good for this country. And it shows that, you know, soccer in this country is not just MLS, but there is a whole umbrella of leagues and teams that help develop players.
Clemente, with the way that USL is structured, do you think we're going to see promotion relegation at any point here in the next 5 or 10 years? I mean, specifically in USL, MLS is a completely different story, obviously. But do you think this is trending towards pro rel?
Well, yeah, I think they want to test it in the USL because it's more low risk. When we talk about MLS and relegation and promotion, you have owners who spend a lot of money buying into the league, and they don't really want their teams relegated. In the USL, it's different. The buy-in is much lower. It's a good place to experiment. So, yeah, I think there might be experimentation there. It's definitely the way they're setting up the divisions. It looks like they're aiming towards that, and that's a good thing. In the end of the day, if teams really want to get out of that structure, they're going to end up in MLS, like Cincinnati or some other franchises. So I think it's good that this exists as kind of a testing ground before MLS ever comes around to the idea.
All right, Clemente, let's get to the real reason why we have you on the show, and it's to talk about and contrast and compare the situations between the San Jose Earthquakes to Houston and what's going on with Columbus and Austin. For our listeners, could you give us a little historical context or just the backstory to why the Earthquakes did get relocated to Houston?
Sure. So amidst all the talk currently about moving Columbus to Austin, the only other time the league ever moved a team was back in the mid-2000s when, indeed, the San Jose Earthquakes moved to Houston and became the Houston Dynamo. Before that, they were known as the San Jose Clash. Now, there's some major differences here between that situation and the current one. At the time, the league owned the Earthquakes. And so Phil Anschutz, who owns AEG, ended up sort of buying the team. And he already owned the Colorado Rapids and the LA Galaxy. And so he was one of the trophies named after him. He's actually one of the few people in the early years of the league was bankrolling a bunch of teams and keeping the league afloat. So at the time, the Earthquakes played at Spartan Stadium, which was not owned by them. So all the revenue that they made at the stadium did not go to the team. The team had, sort of average attendance, kind of low attendance. They were making no money. In other words, they were losing tens of millions of dollars. And so the natural move was, we have to get this team out of here. We either that or we need a buyer, right? But at the time, nobody was buying into MLS, not like today. Mm-hmm. So nobody came forward. And so amidst all the gnashing and the tradition of soccer in San Jose and all that, the team ended up moving to Houston. And as we know, the team was very successful in Houston and won back-to-back MLS titles and then went on to compete for the title years later. And then the Earthquakes kind of came back as a rebrand in San Jose years later.
Absolutely, Clemente. And one thing that we've been getting, as Steven has mentioned, is a lot of feedback whenever we do mention the San Jose to Houston move. People are like, that's completely different. Those are two completely different things. Do you see any similarities between the two, between that move and the potential move of the Columbus Crew to Austin?
I mean, look, you have to give credit to the people who say it's different because it is different. At the time, they were looking for an owner, and they moved out of desperation. The situation in Columbus now is mostly out of one of greed, which is Mapfre Stadium is sort of outdated. It's this erector set of a stadium that, many American soccer fans are attached to because the U.S. won many games against Mexico there, and it's become sort of this special place, spiritual home for American soccer. But the truth is, the stadium wouldn't necessarily house a high school team nowadays. There's no luxury boxes. There's nothing there, nothing in the area. So the stadium is outdated, and they want to build one downtown. The issue is that the city doesn't want to pay for it, and we get into the usual arguments over downtown stadiums versus one of the suburbs and whether or not a team should be there or not. So it is very different. The similarities are that you're moving the team, and so the fans who are there who are attached to this team, they're upset, obviously, and for them it is ripping a team away from them. And so I always say, we don't have promotion or relegation in this country, but we do have teams that actually move from one city to another, which in a lot of ways is a lot worse because there are going to be no fans left in Columbus if they move to Austin, obviously, right? So you are taking something and snatching it away. I will add, though, that attendance in Columbus is bad, and it is currently last in the league in terms of attendance. They average about 12,000 fans a game, which is not great for a team that's playoff bound, and that is actually playing some pretty good soccer. So,
Clemente, I've had a lot of people on Twitter come at me about, come at me basically saying that I don't know what I'm talking about when I talk about how I don't think MLS fans really care so much that the San Jose Earthquakes moved to Houston, and that when you look at things, when you break things down and look at things on the surface, this the Earthquake relocating to Houston is one of the original franchises relocating, kind of like how Columbus potentially could to Austin. For people who aren't familiar or who haven't had their their mentions or DMs blown up by Save the Crew fans, could you talk about what the differences are between the Earthquake relocation to Houston versus the Crew's potential relocation to Austin?
Well, right. I mean, basically what we're getting at is that if San Jose had not moved, they would have disappeared, right? The league would have probably killed the team like they did with Miami and Tampa, right? In the case of Columbus, the team could still live in Columbus. I mean, that's the difference, is that they don't have to move to Austin. The move is greedy on the part of the owners of the Columbus Crew, because sure, the team is not doing well in attendance, but trust me, if the team were to win MLS Cup this year, that attendance would grow next season. Trust me, because people would jump on the bandwagon, even locally. So that is the major difference, that the owner, in this case, is seen as someone who's very greedy. And you can't argue with that. And he wants to make money, right? So that's not a bad thing. But if you're a fan of this team and you're very close to it, then you feel that they're putting greed over passion and love for your team. And that's the major difference. At the time, the Earthquakes really had no chance. Either they moved or they would disappear. And so that's what happened. That's the major difference. And that's why Crew fans are so passionate about it, and why so many people are supporting keeping Columbus where they are.
Absolutely. And Clemente, I'm curious, what was the pushback media-wise? Obviously, it was a whole different age regarding technology and what media has come to, but were people, or were, my big point is that kind of what Jake was going off on, people don't care. American sports, there's a lot of relocation going on and off, but back then, was there within the league, or the fans within the league, were they looking at this and confused by it, or were they like, okay, well, at least this makes sense. We can see why they're moving to Houston. And now looking back, the Earthquakes did get a team back. Ultimately, Houston did win 2 cups, and
right.
A lot of them are kind of disappointed with the fact that the players went on and were successful. It'd be interesting to see Columbus, in a situation, if Columbus were to get moved to Austin, the team right now is quite successful. What if they get some momentum, a little more money gets thrown into the squad, they make a run for a cup, and then, if years down the road, Columbus does come back to MLS and, they sit at the bottom of the league because, they have to restart from scratch.
Right. Well, look, the major difference is that it was 10 years ago, 11 years ago, and in the world of American soccer, 10 years is like a lifetime, right? So 10 years ago, when the team left San Jose, there were a lot of broken hearts, but there really was no big media outcry. And the other major difference was Twitter was not what it is today. So fans now that are very vocal can get on social media and create a groundswell, right? Create a hashtag and start a movement, which has now been afoot for now over a little more than a year. And so that's the major difference, right? So, social media is helping, keep the Crew alive, or at least keep this message alive when at times it didn't really have that groundswell, because it didn't exist. The other similarity is that we're moving a team from one place to Texas, right? That's the other similarity, that the Earthquakes moved to Houston. This would be moving a team to Austin. So, there's some similarities in this Venn diagram of American soccer where, teams are joined in very odd ways. And I point out in my article that I wrote a few months back how the Houston-San Jose game is a bit of a rivalry, because San Jose Earthquakes then did reemerge as a new team years later, and it was fairly successful. And the other player that they both have in common is Steve Wondolowski, so which is interesting. But this is kind of the overlapping nature of American soccer. But the major difference today, in a nutshell, is Twitter. I will say that is the thing that elevated the conversation and kept saved the Crew in the spotlight.
Clemente, do you think that MLS could reach a conclusion like they did with San Jose and Houston, and essentially giving an expansion spot to a future Columbus team should Columbus move to Austin? Do you think they might reach that point, especially with a lot of the backlash they've been getting because of this saga?
Yeah, so the other similarity is that it may all turn out the same way, which is the team moves to Austin, does a pretty good job, gets a nice shiny new stadium, everyone's happy, and then a few years from now, there was a new team in Columbus with a new owner, potentially with somebody with more money, who realizes, hey, there's a big void here. Columbus is a major American soccer city, and we should definitely have a team here. I mean, that's a little consolation for Crew fans today who have to sort of hope that happens, right? Someone has to come in, a benefactor who says, sure, I'll put some money in and we'll create a team when, the fans are arguing, why not just do that now? Why not just, help this team out now? Why is the local city council not approving a stadium? Why, all these whys, right? And, the big issue here overall nationally too is the taxpayers want to pay for stadiums for rich, football, soccer, baseball team owners. And the answer usually is no. And that's become sort of the big issue in a civic way. Some of these other cities love having soccer come to their towns, like Atlanta or Nashville, Seattle. These other places love having Portland. They love having soccer teams come to them. And so it sort of depends on the groundswell, and what MLS thinks is a good business decision. And we can't argue that MLS has made some really good decisions over the past 2 decades to keep this league not just afloat, but growing.
The original file got deleted. Well, here we're missing a question. So when it rains, it pours. The question here was asked by, I believe, Armand, and it was regarding Alexi Lawless's proposition to give Columbus a USL team.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting proposition and it's kind of a consolation prize. And maybe that would be a way of doing what we just said, which is, hey, we give them a USL franchise. It starts growing in popularity, and you know what? We'll give them a spot in MLS in a couple of years, which may be a good idea. I often find that whenever Lawless does a halftime rant about anything, usually people do the opposite, so maybe that's not helping Columbus at all. My fear is that he speaks from the heart. If you know Alexi personally, and if you've ever interviewed him or met him, he's very passionate about American soccer, and he's sort of like a fan advocate, and I think he sort of thinks this could be a good compromise. And maybe it is, maybe it is, and in a world of promotion and relegation, it wouldn't matter, right? Because USL, because the USL and MLS would sort of be one league, and then maybe Columbus would go up and down. And, I don't know. I mean, this is all something that maybe could happen in the future. But do I think it's a good idea? Maybe. But I think Columbus fans might actually be offended, knowing that their team would move to Austin and they would get as a consolation prize, hey, look, we're going to give you this team full of no-name players that are going to compete in the lower league. And you know what? Maybe one day, hey, you can make it too. I don't think they're going to go for that.
Yeah, it's interesting, no doubt, what's going to pan out. Clemente, we really appreciate you taking the time here on this Sunday just to chat for us for a couple of minutes to give us more context into the situation regarding, Columbus to Austin and, going back through MLS archives, which is incredible. Think about the league's been around for 23 years and, you already got to find some people who are historians. So,
yeah, it's true.
It's interesting. But last question here. How do you see this playing out? We've asked multiple people. Everybody gives us the typical, I have no idea. But what's your gut telling you?
Okay, so my gut tells me a couple of things, which is we're entering October, which is a fork in the road for me. So if Columbus goes on and wins MLS Cup this year, right, in the next 3 months, then we have a different story, I think, than what I think will happen, which is the team will eventually have to move, whether it's in 2019 or 2020. Sort of the buzz, sort of thing to keep an eye on too is they started selling season tickets for next season, and apparently they started doing that already, at least marketing them for 2019. So, which is interesting because it tells you that, even they don't know whether or not they're going to be in Austin or in Columbus next year. But I think look at this team, look at how they do in the playoffs. That will matter. Right, that's a big indicator of whether or not the team will move. MLS does not want to have a public relations nightmare on their hands. If the team wins MLS Cup, they're not moving. Not this year. It looks really bad to have your champion move. But if they don't win it, which is a real possibility, I mean, they're currently fourth in the East. Anything can happen in the playoffs. Then I think you're going to see more talk of them moving, and then maybe they're going to be moving by 2020. That's my prediction.
So wait. So you're saying that if they win the Cup, there's no chance that they move?
No, I'm not saying no chance. I think the chance gets diminished big time.
Okay.
Because, like I said, the league is now, the league gets more attention than it did back in 04, 05, 06 when Houston and San Jose was happening, right? So it would be a PR nightmare to have your champion move. I mean, it would be headlines around the world. The MLS champion would be moving from one city to another, because in Europe, this is like sort of unheard of that a team would sort of lock up and move. Europeans always laugh at the word franchise when Americans say, the New York Yankees are a franchise, right? In Europe, it's different. The stakeholders are not just the owner, but the fans. Here, the fans are treated more like, hey, this is a product, and you're buying the product, but you don't own any of it, and we don't really care what you think, right? And that's what they're saying to crew fans right now, right? So I think the big asterisk is if they win the cup. That's what I think.
That's real interesting. I think you're the first one that has mentioned that on the show, and that's something I don't think we would have thought of. But that's something we'll have to talk about after the interview. Clemente, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to give you the opportunity to plug your books, plug your Twitter, where we can find your work.
Yeah, please. So go to scarecrowpress.com and you can see my books there. I've written one about the U.S. national team last year that is of interest to you as soccer fans, and you can follow me on Twitter at Clemente Lisi.
Awesome. Thanks again, Clemente.
Thanks for having me.